Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, and I'm joined as always by
Annie Berglund.
Annie, we have made it to the last webisode of the course. We're in basically walking up to the last week of the course. So this is going to be about preparing students for exam 3 and, preparing them for the end of the term. So we'll talk a little bit about their final assignment as well. To start off with, in our last webisode, we spent some time talking about the Enlightenment. And there are lots of positives that we can draw from the Enlightenment. But as you think about this era, what are things that maybe trouble you about the Enlightenment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I addressed a little bit of it. You guys got kind of a preview in the last webisode when I discussed Equiano, who will come back later in this webisode as well. But the Enlightenment is clearly really important for many reasons. One of those reasons is we have a developing notion of individual human rights. And that kind of is in civil rights, political rights, and also just human rights. We have theories like that of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and other political philosophers of the time that started to aid democratic revolutions against governments that seemed to have broken their social contracts with their citizens, right? So we start seeing this idea that if a government isn't going to uphold your individual human rights to life, liberty, and property, you can revolt and you can make your own government that is more perfect, that actually wants to uphold your rights as a citizen should you enter into a social contract with it. So we see these shifts. At the same time, society is really not that different during the time of the Enlightenment in terms of politics. So most of the governments at this time are monarchies. There's a couple exceptions. There's still many powerful churches that have their hand in the way that politics works. But these democratic revolutions do affect a lot of change. At the same time, even though they are promoting these ideas of life, liberty, and property, we see that the big pitfall here, or perhaps the underbelly of the Enlightenment, is that no, like in a lot of senses, things don't change. These democratic revolutions are fought and won by elites, land-holding males, specifically Western, generally white land-holding males. And those are the people that are reaping the rewards. Those are the people that continue to stay in positions of power or wealth and prosperity. And then on the other side of that, you have the idea that, okay, these values in the Enlightenment that are so important to us today, specifically in America, these values of equality, fraternity, tolerance, liberty, that's all great, but they haven't extended in the Enlightenment period to very important, large parts of the population. And that's to women who were seen as second-class citizens, that they weren't able to enter into the social or public sphere, and then also people of different races other than white. And we see this justification of mistreatment, if not brutal treatment, of a non-white elite or wealthy men. We see justification through the means of Enlightenment ideas, right? That women are less rational, or people of color are less rational, and therefore they need somebody above them to order their lives or to utilize them in a way to make them functional. It's really, I mean, it's terrible language, but that is the reality. So we have these notions of race that didn't even develop until the Enlightenment, until there needed to be a justification for atrocities like the slave trade. So there, even though we're taking these important steps towards human rights, we still see that there are still the haves and the have-nots. There's still people who are on the margins facing these insurmountable obstacles to fully realize their civil, political, individual rights, and that the Enlightenment is still very much today a work in progress. Earlier in its history, CWC used to spend a lot of time on the 19th and 20th centuries towards the end of the class, and that's not as emphasized as much now in the current Gen Ed curriculum. But we do close that time period a little bit. So, Sam, what are you most happy that we've brought back from the 19th and 20th centuries in CWC?
I think the things that excite me the most that we're able to put into the summer course that doesn't work itself into our sort of in-semester versions of CWC. There's 4 thinkers and then a major event, and what they have in common is they're all things that take kind of the logic of the Enlightenment and continue to play it out as we move into the 19th and the early 20th century. So the thinkers are people like Marx, Darwin, Freud, and Nietzsche. They're taking some of that Enlightenment project and again pushing it further. So famously, I think the clearest example of this is someone like Nietzsche, who is looking at the sort of history of philosophy and religion in the West, and how, if you look at the Middle Ages, God has great explanatory power, right? People needed God to explain natural phenomena, to explain changes in weather, to explain natural disasters, to explain diseases like the Black Death. As we start to move into the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, Enlightenment, we're starting to use reason and science to answer those things. And we end up sort of pushing God out of a place where God has explanatory power. Like now we don't need to, if we're talking about a disease, we don't need to talk about God to explain the disease, because now we understand microorganisms and bacteria and viruses and things like that. And it's like, okay, well, now we can explain it. So this is where we end up with deism. If we don't need God to explain the phenomena in this world, then you have God sort of floating above the world as the creator, but the God that doesn't intervene in the world, which is deism. So it's almost like you have God and then you have the world, and there's this tether between them. And Nietzsche looks at that and basically says, doesn't it sort of feel like we're holding on to this old notion of God just as a vestige of, the medieval church and the medieval world? And Nietzsche's saying the next logical, rational step to take is to sever that tie and say, we actually don't need that anymore. So when Nietzsche writes that God is dead and we have killed him, that's what he's talking about. He's saying we have, through the projects we've been on, we have basically killed God, but we hold on to that idea. And Nietzsche's thinking about that question. What does that mean to say we no longer have a need for that thing? And what happens when we start to realize that we have done that? And what does that mean about our position in the world? I find those questions really interesting to think about. Marx, Darwin, Freud are all, again, going deeper into that scientific revolution, Enlightenment project, and pushing it forward. And in doing it, calling some of those notions of rationality into question in terms of thinking about what are the motivators of people. So those 4 thinkers I'm excited to be able to at least start to think about. And I would say in future courses, you will encounter these thinkers again in a much more robust, deeper way. And then the event that I think is so crucial for thinking about the Enlightenment project and maybe the tail end of the Enlightenment project is the First World War. Because we take all of those notions of the Enlightenment, progress, reason, rights, all of these things, and we add to it a century of industrialization and machinery and all of these things, and then we get World War I, which is this big industrial war. People are slaughtered by these new technologies and by these views of progress and all of these things, and all those things get called into question. And that is really the beginning of the 20th century. So First World War is in the 1914 to 1918, but we can think of that as really philosophically the beginning of the 20th century is all of the questions that grow out of the First World War. And that's where we start to think about some of those modern values and start to think about what are the holes in those. And that's where we start to think about postmodernity. So I think those events are so helpful to introduce here. Annie, part of why students take CWC is that it sets up future courses that they're going to take in the Gen Ed curriculum. So there's sort of two main courses that branch out of CWC, or I should say categories of courses. So one of the things that CWC is a prerequisite for is at Bethel what we call U courses. That's the U tag. And Annie, you have taught a U course at Bethel. Can you tell us about what a U course is and how it builds off of CWC?
Yeah, so what a U course is essentially doing is saying, okay, you already have the foundations of Western civilization built into the curriculum. Now let's go outside of what we would deem as traditionally Western and look at cultures or histories or philosophies that come from other areas of the world. So some of those areas, you could define them still as the West, certainly. But the history is perhaps more complicated than simply starting in the Mediterranean and shifting to Western Europe and then to the New World. So if we think about it, most of the populations of the world, or most of the population rather, is not Western, right? So most people in the world right now live in Asia. And so it's important that we are also seeing the other side of how Eastern culture developed, or how cultures in the South developed. So I taught history of China, Japan, and Korea, and it's basically the other side of the story, right? So it's like a survey history specifically of East Asia, so China, Japan, Korea, from about the same time period. So we start around 500s BC and go all the way to the 20th century. Except this time I'm telling the story of East Asia. And so what you see is there's kind of these interweaving ideas, interweaving ideologies across the East and West. You see some of those connections we make. And so you have like, man, at the time of the great philosophers of the West, there's also great philosophers of the East. You have people like Buddha and Confucius, who are fundamental for the development of Eastern culture. And you also have like technology that's building in the East, and that's being developed and adapted by the West, right? So things like gunpowder and the printing press, they started in the East, and they were traded and borrowed and adapted later on. So we see kind of a lot of these connections that you already have built up from CWC, but expanding outwards more. So particularly, it's not cultures that are American or European, but they're connected to a lot of the themes and values we've talked about in this class. So some other courses that you could take are from the philosophy department, poli-sci, anthropology, sociology. So things like medieval Islamic philosophy. We have Introduction to International Relations, taught by poli-sci professors. We have Latin American civilizations, history of Islam, and a lot of these courses are taught by CWC professors. So they even have in their lens some of those big ideas that we talk about in this course, and can kind of use that as a foundation for the class. So I really recommend students. I mean, I know you have to take a U course, but even for an elective, it pairs really nicely with your major courses to learn a little bit more about cultures around the world. It's almost like a travel course for you. So speaking of travel courses, and also, I think, Sam, you had mentioned World War I in the last question. Sam, after CWC, obviously, it's your favorite course. Why do you like teaching L courses? What is an L course, and how do they build on CWC?
Well, like the U courses you talked about, L courses is a category. So I tend to think about it through the lens of history because that's my field. But you can take L courses in philosophy, political science, literature, all kinds of different areas. And what the L course is kind of what I was talking about earlier. It is picking up the story of the West, but pushing it forward really up to the end of the 20th. Beginning of the 21st century. So it's looking at the 19th and 20th century, looking at some of those, at the world where the major arc of CWC leads off. So we end CWC traditionally around the time of the Enlightenment. We start to talk a little bit about the things that are starting to call the Enlightenment into question, people like Wollstonecraft, Equiano. But in an L course, then we move into thinking about how does the Enlightenment become the Industrial Revolution, and how does that then feed the 20th century. So it's wrestling with some of this mental furniture that we've been talking about in these last few in this last unit, right? Some of those modern notions about science and reason and progress and rights, and what it means to be a human, and how so it deals with modernity in that way. But then it also, as we move into the 20th century, which is a century that sees 2 world wars, it sees the use of nuclear weapons, it sees multiple genocides, it sees this battle of ideologies that creates a Cold War for the second half of the 20th century. So it's all of these things are showing cracks in this mental furniture of modernity and leading to postmodernity. And I think this is where Martin Buber is really helpful, because we talk about Buber and his ideas of homelessness and habitation, and there's definitely a sense of habitation that grows out of the Enlightenment project, to say, okay, our new habitation is reason, is the sort of scientific ability to categorize and understand the world, to understand the world through these laws of nature, to harness these laws of nature to create technologies, this idea of rights, all of these things, right? You have that habitation, and then the 20th century blows that up, and we move into, a way, if we're thinking, of painting history with a very broad brush, we start to move into an epoch of homelessness. So I'm tipping my hand a little bit here and thinking, I would say since the 20th century and the 21st century, I think if 500 years from now, people will look back and say, this was an epoch of homelessness. And the reason that I say that is because if we think about the world that we live in, we think about this as a world that still holds on to some of those modern ideas, but is also what we would think of as postmodern. It's calling those things into question. And even think about the title postmodern. All that means is that we're no longer moderns. We're no longer 19th, 20th century people. We're now something else, but we don't even know what we are, because there's lots of things contesting in the broader culture to say, well, what direction should we go? There is no clear organizing principle for people in the West. So an L course is going to dig into some of those things, but it might dig into it by looking at history and politics and war. It might do it by looking at literature. It might do it by looking at philosophy. It might do it by looking at contemporary theology and saying, how does Christian theology wrestle with the issues of the 19th and 20th century? So there's lots of ways to do that, but I think L courses are kind of amazing for helping us wrestle with those things and drawing that sharp line that really leads to the world that we live in today.
So we are all nearing the end of summer CWC. It's our last webisode. All that's left is tomorrow's exam, and then what we call the exit interview. So do you have any final words of advice or clarification for the exit interview, Sam?
Yeah, so this is my one chance to kind of talk with you about the exit interview. So this will be due by Thursday, July 29th. So once your exam becomes available, I'll also make the exit interview available. It's not due until, so you'll take your exam on Monday. The exit interview is not due until Thursday. So you have a few days to work on this. So there are 5 questions in the exit interview. Each of them is looking for around 250 word answers. I mean, that should be kind of the range of what it should take to answer these questions. So if you think about it, it's like writing 5 of the little essays that we've done this semester. So I would say it's kind of difficult to do all in one sitting. That's why we make it available a few days early. So I would say when you finish that exam, allow yourself to take a break, take a breath, then go look at those questions. Maybe even let your brain kind of stew on them for a little bit. Don't sit down and bang out answers to them right away, but give yourself some time to think about them, to get away from the questions, and then start to go through and answer those questions. And they're due by 10 a.m. on Thursday, July 29th. My advice would be to read the questions really carefully. The biggest pitfall that I see in student writing in this course, teaching it over the years, is that students get really passionate about what they're writing, but then they end up not answering the question. Even looking about this summer, the number of times I've addressed in my feedback is like, oh, this is really interesting what you have to say, but remember the question's asking about this. So make sure you're actually answering the question. The other big thing is use details. And when I say use details, I mean use specific details from the course. Talk about specific people, specific readings, specific things you've seen in the museums. That's going to be the answer or the difference between an answer that might be 8 out of 10 and 10 out of 10 is the person or people who are using real details. And details isn't just name dropping. It's, if you're going to mention a person, like, talk about what they did. Talk about how what they did applies to how this question's answered. That's what I'm going to be looking for as I grade those exit interviews. Hopefully, this should be somewhat fun because this is a chance to kind of reflect on what we've learned this unit. So instead of having you write a big paper, it's just writing a series of kind of short answers to some reflection questions on the course as a whole. Annie, that is all the time we have for this segment. We want to save as much time as we can to jump into segment 2, where we will be talking about our individual lists of the 5 most important figures from Unit 3. Welcome back. We are here to talk about our 5 most important people from this unit. So, Annie, we're going to play our last game of Food Chain. Just a little score update. So, again, in Unit 1, you won both games to take a 2-0 lead. I came back and won both games in Unit 2 to tie it up, and I narrowly beat you and make the case. So, I have a 1-game lead. So if I win this, I win. If you win this, we tie, and then I don't know how we break the tie, but we'll find a way.
Oh, man. This is high stakes.
It's very high stakes. So we each have our list of our 5 most important people. Remember, students, this is really a way for us to help you review for this exam, to talk about a lot of important figures from this unit. Annie, do you want to kick us off? Who do you have at number 5?
Yeah, okay. Well, a couple things, some meta stuff about my list. I put a lot of thought into this. So my list is mostly looking at political and social revolutionaries or social figures through the Enlightenment. So a lot of people that are critiquing some of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. So that's kind of like the meta part of this. I don't know why I'm giving you this context, but I find it important. I'm really proud of my list. And I also have a fun fact at the end of each person. So look forward to the fun facts. Maybe it'll help me win some points with some of you. So my first person is Wollstonecraft. And I have Wollstonecraft on my list for a number of reasons. The first being she is one of the few female voices that we get in Unit 3 and kind of that we get in any of the units in CWC. And that's not because we neglect putting in women's voices. It's because that's an obstacle of studying history of that time. Women were not voices that were being heard. They were not seen as intellectual beings that had something to say about society and culture and government. So somebody like Wollstonecraft is incredibly important for the fact that she represents half of the population of the West, right? And that's a heavy thing for her to carry, but we need to listen to where those voices are that we can find. So she is widely regarded as the founder of Western feminism. I felt she needed to be on this list for that reason. And her big critique is that the Enlightenment ideals of equality, liberty, tolerance, those are all great, except for they are only available to a portion of society, right? So this goes back to what I was saying at the start of the lecture, or at the start of the webisode. So we have this social political sphere. It's public facing, and that's where men can do their work. That's where men are it's accessible to them, and it's acceptable that they're there. Women, on the other hand, are in the home sphere, right? And so these are 2 separate spheres. They are not to intermingle. And so if women weren't in public spaces, there's kind of no public record of their thoughts, right? And so what she wrote and criticized with other Enlightenment philosophers was that she was saying, like, I'm actually exemplifying the spirit of the Enlightenment to its fullest, because I'm saying if somebody has reason, then we should be able to let that person speak and think freely, right? And we should also give that person the same access and the same resources that we would give anybody else, because we are all born rational beings, right? So what she was looking for was rational relationship with men, to say like we can be just as good of citizens, we can be better citizens than we are now, we can be better mothers, better daughters, if we are given the same access to education, if we are allowed to enter the public sphere just like men would, right? And so it's something that is mutually beneficial, not just for women but also for men. So she uses the lens of education kind of as this critique, especially in the reading that you all have for CWC. And it's certainly a very persuasive argument, saying that justice and equality, these Enlightenment ideals, are falling short. So fun fact about Wollstonecraft is her daughter is named Mary Shelley, and she wrote Frankenstein. So if you all haven't read Frankenstein yet, I would say definitely read it. I only just read it for the first time this year. And if you have already read it, maybe go back and reread it from a feminist perspective, and it might have a little bit something different to say to you. Okay, Sam, your turn.
I really like having Wollstonecraft on your list, and I will say she's somebody who doesn't make my list, and that's I acknowledge that as a major omission. When you do these lists of 5, it's kind of tricky because you kind of have to pick your categories that you're going to talk about. So I at my number 4 list, I have the person that I sort of picked instead of Wollstonecraft, so I'll point that out. At my number 5 for me, I have somebody to talk about economics. Now, you're going to have a different economist on your list later on. I have Adam Smith. And I realize that my list is very heavy on the Enlightenment part of this unit, because I do think when I think about the Enlightenment, I think about pretty rapid major paradigm shifts where we move from one thing to another. And what that happens in the Enlightenment because people adopt elements of kind of the values coming out of this Newtonian worldview. If we sort of think about the world as a rational world run by these laws of nature, and if we buy that paradigm shift, then it allows us or forces us to ask some big questions. So for Smith, he's looking at the idea of economics and saying, well, what if there are natural laws that guide economics? In the past, in the Middle Ages, the way the economy runs is it's a very controlled, regulated economy. It's controlled from the top, and it's really controlled with this notion of, if we think about the Middle Ages, right, that the government is put in place by God, and the government is trying to do God's work in the economy. So they're trying to set the just price for any products that are being produced, food that's being produced. So there's this sense of like justice and common good in that. But when we buy into the Enlightenment project and we say, well, actually that God doesn't intervene in that way, then it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't instill the government with this power to sort of shape this mercantile economy. Instead, maybe there are laws of nature that guide this. And this is Smith's big idea. Laws like the law of supply and demand, that those things will guide the economy. And if everybody's just freed to be free economic actors, that the economy will work itself out, that the correct price will find itself where it's the price that I'm willing to sell and you're willing to buy. So Smith, that's the radical shift that he brings. Now, this also sets up the world of the Industrial Revolution. This laissez-faire capitalism becomes the engine for the Industrial Revolution. And industrialization has some really big qualities, right? You get this rapid progress of technology and products and all of these things. The Industrial Revolution also has many, 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 many dark aspects to it. Mm-hmm. But I think Smith is important for pushing that shift, for saying, what if we think radically different about how this works? I think he's almost the perfect example when we talk about the Enlightenment project of saying, we move to this world of rational laws of nature and we let that run things. So we live in a world that's so dominated by capitalist economies that I think Smith is really important to have on the list. Annie, who do you have at number 4?
I love that you had that one first so that I can talk about Marx, because that's the other economist I think you would need to have on here. I didn't have Smith on mine, but Marx borrows a lot from Smith and builds upon a lot of Smith's ideas regarding capitalism. So I have Marx on my list because it's also one that students tend to maybe not have learned much about before, or perhaps there are misunderstandings that kind of surround Marx. Marx is an economist. He's a philosopher. He is not himself a social revolutionary, right? But he writes about social revolutionaries and in some ways predicts some of those occurring later on into the 19th and 20th century. So he also is a figure, again, in my list, somebody, again, critiquing some Enlightenment ideas, right? So he is building upon Adam Smith, but he's also critiquing capitalist economic systems. He's critiquing laissez-faire economics, so hands-off economics, the idea that and the idea that the laws of nature, there are economic laws of nature that can govern it. And he's saying, that can oftentimes lead to capitalists underpaying and overworking their workers, right? And that it leads to exploitation that tries to drive down the cost of production, right? So he's building on Adam Smith, but he's also starting something very new. He joins in with a lot of other Enlightenment thinkers or modern thinkers in rejecting Christian traditions in terms of political system building, right? Or governance. He's also important because he takes that conversation that, Sam, you were just talking about with Smith's capitalist notions and says, yes, there is an underside, right? Especially with the Industrial Revolution, which you already hinted at. So there is exploitation that a lot of times economic growth in capitalist countries or capitalist economies is paired with an extreme income inequality. And so that is the history of class struggles. And so his idea is that what happens is countries become capitalist, and then we have social revolutions, and then we move towards industrial workers being able to overthrow their oppressive governments, right? And that's kind of the larger meta-narrative of history. And so what we see with him, he's so vitally important for Western civilization because of the implications he has on social transformations in the 19th and 20th centuries in the West and across the globe. So things like the 1917 Russian Revolution, communist projects in China and in Cuba. So we have all these new revolutionaries and millions of people who are impacted by Marxism and different ideologies like communism or socialism that are inheritors of parts of Karl Marx's ideas. Fun fact about Karl Marx. You got it. So he spent 24 hours in jail for his involvement in a drinking club in his university campus. There you go. All right, Sam, your turn.
At number 4, I have the person that I have on my list instead of Wollstonecraft. And I will say he does not, because I said the word he does not fill the same role, but I have a gap because I don't have Wollstonecraft's voice. As I look at your list, the biggest thing that jumps out to me is you don't have much in terms of an explicitly religious figure for thinking about this, right? So I put John Wesley here because I actually think the Methodist Wesley's work and the Methodist movement is so unbelievably important in the 18th century. During this time of Enlightenment, that you also have this wave of religious revivals in Europe and America. You have the First Great Awakening, and then in the 19th century, early 19th century, you have the Second Great Awakening. And this is fueled a lot by Wesley, by Methodism, and by people in the orbit of John Wesley. So even George Whitefield is in the orbit of John Wesley, because Wesley doesn't do important work in America, but Whitefield does. Wesley does his work in England. And what really moves me about Wesley is that he is taking this idea of some of these ideas from pietism, right? And he is preaching a different kind of revival. He's preaching a revival of a religion of the heart, right? During an age of reason, when everyone's focusing on the mind, an age of deism, when everyone's focusing on religion as understood through reason, Wesley is preaching sermons aimed at people's hearts, aimed at people's emotions, and leading to genuine religious revival in England. And when he gets sort of booted out of preaching in the church, that doesn't stymie him. Instead, he goes to where the unchurched people are. So he goes to preach in public squares. He preaches in fields to farm workers and outside of the people who, because of this industrial economy, aren't able to go to church. They don't have the time and access to do that. So Wesley brings Christianity to them. And then when we think about, especially as we move into the late 18th, early 19th century, Christianity on the American frontier exists largely because of Methodist circuit preachers who work to keep the church alive, to bring the gospel to the American frontier, where you don't have cities or towns, or churches or things like that. So how do you do that? How do you organize that? And it's Methodist circuit preachers that do that. So I think Wesley is so unbelievably important as this voice of religious revival during the Age of Reason. So he's number 4 on my list. Annie, who do you have at number 3?
Okay, Wesley is such a good one. I also think about in other semesters of CWC, we talk about the establishment of African American churches, and how a lot of that is came from the Methodist tradition, and what a testament to Methodism that is a legacy it has, right? That it was something that fueled religious vigor in a community that is so oppressed and facing obstacles in literally every field, including religion, right? So that's a great one. And they play a huge role in the abolition movement in America. Absolutely. Yeah. I wish I had him on my list, so I'm glad that you had him. Okay, so my third, though, is in a similar vein, kind of moving in this direction, is Equiano. So I talked about Equiano quite a bit in the last webisode, so I won't go too far in depth with him. But as you know, he was enslaved, but he was able to win his freedom. And he writes his memoir about his experience being captured in Africa and on the Middle Passage. And his memoir becomes widely spread throughout the English population and throughout Europe. And the Americas. So he is important not only because of his starting this slave narrative as its own form of literature, but also because he appeals to religion and reason, right? And he says it is essential that we end the slave trade because of religion and reason, right? Because this is essential to what the Bible says, and also because it degrades the reason of rational human beings, right? That this justification for the slave trade is actually contradictory to Enlightenment ideas. So similar to Wollstonecraft, another individual using Enlightenment ideas to critique Enlightenment ideas, right? So he says slavery deprives enslaved people of their virtue, that it forces them to live a life at war with their slave owners, right? So it helps to explain any actions of slaves against their owners, to say, like, it is because of what we were sold into that we would have to act in those ways, right? And it's because of what is being deprived of us. So if you would, in a similar kind of tone as Wollstonecraft, it's like, if you would but give us freedom, you would see that we are just as rational, right? As that we can be great citizens, better citizens, right? If we were just given that ability. So similar vein as Wollstonecraft. And he holds the responsibilities, the horrors of slave owners. He holds them accountable. A fun fact about him is that there is a crater on Mercury named after Equiano. There you go. Did you know that, Sam?
I did not. That's news to me.
It's a weird fun fact, but there you go. Who's your number 3?
At number 3, I love everything you said about Equiano. I thought about putting Equiano on my list. Instead, I went in a very slightly different direction and put on my list arguably somebody we could consider the American Equiano, and that is Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass, a lot of the things you say that Equiano is doing in England for the abolition movement, for shedding light on the realities of slavery, Frederick Douglass is doing in America. So he writes his account of his life, which, like I said, sheds light on slavery. He's pointing to the hypocrisy in the American project, both in terms of the hypocrisy in American Christianity. When he talks about the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land, and he says that there is such a huge gap between those, and that he says, I love the Christianity of Christ, but I despise the Christianity of this land. And he says it's actually impossible to hold those two things together, which is a pretty damning statement about sort of the state of American Christianity in his time. And I think it's convicting to think about in our own time. Like, do we still have what are the gaps we still have, as we think about those things? And I think, thinking about slavery, it is among the major issues that defined the American experience. To this very day, the legacy of slavery to this very day impacts American history. It is there from the origins of the American project, and even after emancipation, even after the Civil War, Reconstruction, all those things. Like it is still such a dominant piece of American history and shapes so much of that. So I think that Douglas is so unbelievably important. Also, he is somebody who's advocating not just for abolition, but he's advocating for women's suffrage as well, right? So he is thinking about this expansion of these notions of rights and access and political power, beyond just enslaved people, but thinking about women as well. So in that way, he connects with Equiano and Wollstonecraft there. So I think Douglas is somebody we probably don't study enough, and I think is a really important piece of American history that I know. In if I think about the history classes I had in high school, it's a name that I knew, but probably somebody I didn't know as much about as I should have. Annie, who do you have at number 2?
Okay, number 2 is somebody that we talked about in depth last week. That's Isaac Newton. So this is where I'm kind of shifting out of my big scheme of having political and social figures. But I feel like this list would not be complete if I didn't have Isaac Newton. Like, he is that important. Sam, last week, he talked about him as ushering in a paradigm shift. Like, absolutely correct. He is very much so the father of modern science, right? So he explains like how the universe works, that there are these universal principles, that we can discover them, that we can predict outcomes because of these laws of nature, because of these universal principles. And this also then is important for the Enlightenment, right? To say like he is the father of modern science in many ways, but also impacted laws of nature as applied to the economics, like with capitalism and Adam Smith's writing, or the laws of nature applied to politics or philosophy, right? Or all these different aspects of our lives in the social sciences. So he's very important. We spent a lot of time on him last week. I know, Sam, I'm sure, knowing you have him on your list, so I will let you build upon this more in depth. But a fun fact about him is that allegedly, according to his writings, his pet dog burned down his lab at one point, and it ruined 20 years of research. Now, that's according to his writings. But there's a lot of people out there who have studied his life and think that actually didn't happen. So either his dog did burn down his laboratory, or he blamed the burning down of his laboratory on his dog, which is like his version of my dog ate my homework.
Yeah, it's sort of an expanded version of that. I like that. Annie, I love everything you said about Newton. I can't wait to be able to talk about him and build off of this, but I can't be the person I was in last webisode and have Newton at number 2 by definition. So we're going to have to wait just a few minutes to talk about Newton. I have a couple things I want to add to what you said. So number 2, I have John Locke. And again, if we're thinking about paradigm shifts, I talked about this with Smith. Locke is such a big piece in terms of this radical rethinking. So I want to think about this by comparing really quickly John Locke to Martin Luther. So we have this reading Luther on Secular Authority from the end of last unit. And Luther, the basic argument he's making there is Luther is saying that governments come from God. The king has power because God has put the king in power, right? Government authority comes from God. Luther's arguing that the purpose of government, the reason God creates secular authority, is to hold sin in check, that this is a world overrun with sin. So the kings are given power so they can kind of keep sin down by punishing sin, things like this. And then the last piece of that Luther reading would be, if you have a bad king, an evil king, a king who doesn't do great stuff, you kind of have to live with it. You should expect sin and evil in this world. So you can't do anything about it because that person was put in place by God. So you can't have a revolution because you'd be revolting against the order God created. So Luther's very medieval in his way of thinking about government, right? Locke comes along And this is all stuff we've already talked about, but I just want to go through this one more time because I think this is so important. Locke comes around and starts to think differently about where government power comes from, right? He has this idea of the state of nature, and he says the state of nature is great. We're totally free, and we have these natural rights: life, liberty, and property. The only problem with the state of nature is there's nothing to protect those rights. So I have them, but because I'm totally free and everyone else is totally free, we can do whatever we want. So we keep impinging on each other's rights. So Locke says we choose to give up some of that total freedom, and we agree to live according to certain laws. He says we form a commonwealth, we write laws with the expressed purpose of protecting our rights to, particularly our rights to property. So if we're comparing Luther and Locke, Luther says government authority comes from God. Locke says government authority comes from the consent of the governed, the people who form the government. We chose to put this government in power. Luther says the purpose of government is to hold sin in check. Locke says the purpose of government is to protect natural rights. That's a pretty big difference for thinking about with a focus of government. But the real revolution for Locke is this. Remember, Luther, we said if you have a bad government, you kind of have to live with it. You kind of have to suffer. Locke says if you have a bad government that doesn't protect your rights, you have the right and responsibility to have a revolution, to overthrow that government, to tear up the social contract and write a new one. Because for Locke, the government is not sacred. It's not something which was handed down from God. It's something we created. And if we created it, we can tear it apart and build a better one. So why Locke is so important is because he kind of for the first time in the West is giving us a rational justification for political revolution. And that rational justification then becomes the backbone, not just for theory about government, but for things like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, that he becomes the philosophical backbone for that. So Locke is so unbelievably important for this modern sense of where political power comes from, for secularizing government, our view of government in that way, and justifying political revolution. So he's number 2 on my list. Who do you have at number 1?
Sam, that was great. I loved every bit of that because John Locke is my number 1. He is another one of those people where I think you and I both have him on the top of our lists, right? And there's a reason for it. He and Newton, if Newton does this scientific paradigm shift, Locke is doing the political paradigm shift, right? And everything that you said is spot on. One of the most important philosophers of the modern world, father of liberalism, the world that we live in, how the West is basically being run at this point, right? Constitutionalism. If we think about and we take some of those ideas of the right to revolt, right, and how important that was when we see the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and these series of revolutions throughout this 18th and 19th centuries. It's also important to this day, right? Because in our Constitution, we have the right to peaceably assemble. We have the right to speak on behalf of rights we think are not being granted to us, and to critique our governments and be heard by our government, right? And I think that to me is one of the most important rights that we have in our Constitution to this day, because it allows for people who are on the margins, people who are not given a voice, either for reasons of representation in our legislative bodies or other reasons, right? It allows for them to still be heard and to make their case, right, in the public, make it on TV, make it in different ways. And kind of like stopping life in order to show some of these ways that people are facing inequalities or whatever it may be, whatever people are protesting or demonstrating for in the streets. So I think that is hugely important, even when we think about some of those social revolutions occurring even into the 20th century. If you take a U course and you study things like democratization in countries like South Korea. Like one of the biggest, most important parts of the democratization movement was being able to protest in the streets without being gunned down, right? Like to be heard at that degree and to revolt against a government that is not representing them. So I think that's a lot. That's coming from John Locke, and it's a lot to give him all of that. But clearly, he is an important individual for starting a lot of those conversations. Certainly, what you mentioned before about the shift from the divine right theory, right, that like God designates power to people who are in power, those who are in rule, to this social contract theory that is fundamentally different, shifts the power and authority away from older traditions of the medieval world, brings us into the modern age. And we get more of a shift towards secularism in how our government is set up, right? And we can also thank him for ideas surrounding separation of powers, surrounding individual rights. So clearly a very important individual. Fun fact about him, he wrote most of his influential works at the age of 50 and 60 and after. So we all got a lot of time to become world famous philosophers. Like if we got decades, Sam, we got time.
I like that. I don't have as much time, but yes, we have time.
Who's your number one?
My number one obviously is Isaac Newton. We've talked a lot about Newton today. We talked about a lot about Newton in the last webisode, so I'm not going to say too much, but I want to point out one thing about him. Another sort of helpful way to think about his scientific revolution and contributions and this paradigm shift is another way to think about it is that in the Middle Ages, people thought of the world, they conceived of the world like it was a living organism. And the heartbeat of the living organism of the world was God. God was the beating heart. God is why things happen, is how things happen. So it was an organic view of the world. And with Newton, what we get is this shift from thinking about the world like a living organism to thinking about the world like a rational machine. So this is sometimes referred to as the Newtonian world machine, right? That it's all matter that follows these laws, and we can understand how that machine works. So if you take that scientific mindset, that is how we can lead directly into the Enlightenment project to say, well, if we now think of the world like a machine, now we should study the world like it's a rational machine, and we can start to learn these laws of nature, not just in the sciences, but in politics, economics, art, society, all these other places, right? So it contributes there. That Newtonian world machine also has a direct connection to the development of deism. One of the reasons why we end up with deism as this kind of default religion of the Enlightenment is because it masks perfectly onto this Newtonian world machine. This world machine does not need God to tinker with it, does not need God to be involved. God is the creator and author of this machine, but then he winds it up and lets it run. Well, you don't get that view without first having Newton sort of laying out this idea of how we can understand how the world works. So I'm not saying Newton is himself describing deism, but he is laying the track that logically leads us to that. So with all the other things we said about Newton, I think that notion of starting to think of the world like a rational machine is a really helpful way to think about that paradigm shift. Well, Annie, we have two lists. We have some similarities up at the top of the list. Get a little bit further down, 3 through 5, and we have some different angles there. Students, we're curious your thoughts on this. Which list do you think best represents the most important figures from Unit 3 of CWC? Go on to Moodle. We'll have a survey link there. Fill out your survey, vote. This is a really important vote because if I win, I just become the champion. If Annie wins, we tie, and then she and I have to find a way to break this tie somehow. We can keep you in the loop about that. That is all the time we have now. We'll be back in a few moments to wrap up the show. Annie, we're back. It is happy time. Happy birthday to Daniel Radcliffe. The Harry Potter actor turns 32 today. Annie, in 50 words or less, pitch a movie idea that will be sure to win Daniel Radcliffe a Best Actor Oscar.
Okay, I would want him to be in a role where he plays himself in different trajectories of a child actor's life, right? So what happens if the Harry Potter franchise didn't get as big as it was. Like, what happens to his life as a child actor? So he would play himself. It would be confusing because he would have to play himself as a child. Haven't worked through that. I'm not.
We have de-aging technology. So you're sort of pitching like into the Radcliffe verse, like the multiverse of Daniel Radcliffe. That's actually a fairly great idea. I wasn't prepared for that good of an idea, and it was a very simple pitch. You could have said that in an elevator ride. Like, my hat's off to you. That's perfect. I would buy a ticket to that.
Yeah, like semi-autobiographical, but also the multiverse. What happens when Daniel Radcliffe makes one small different choice in his life, and the butterfly effect?
And we could get Charlie Kaufman to write the script. This would be great. I'm totally in on this. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Sold. Okay. So happy anniversary to the Ford Motor Company, who sold its first car this day in 1903, 118 years ago. Sam, you drive a 2006 Ford. How's that working out for you?
Not great. It's been a very hot summer. So I drive a small black Ford 500 from 2006, which is not 118 years old, but it kind of seems like it is. And at this point, the air conditioner doesn't work. So a few weeks ago, I had an 8-hour drive I needed to take on we'll call it a 91-degree day, without air conditioning, and it was rough. So maybe that's a sign that I'm just cheap. Maybe it's a sign that I need to get a new car, but it's not great. I don't want to disparage the Ford Motor Company as a whole, but at this point, my particular Ford, not loving it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they can't control the weather, but man, does that suck. I am so sorry.
It's not great. Annie, happy trails to Sally Ride. The physicist and astronaut became the first American woman in space, passed away on this day in 2012. Annie, there's lots of talk in 2021 about civilians going into space. Would you have any interest yourself in going into space?
Absolutely not. Not ever. Not at all. So first of all, I'm terrified of heights. So and flying on planes, I have to do that a lot living in South Korea and fly back to the US, and it sucks. I'm scared all the time. I'm the person that has dreams on the plane that the plane is crashing, and then I wake up in a start and the plane is still okay, but it is very terrifying. I feel like I would just have that all the time in space. Also, it just seems really luxury and wasteful, and just kind of this is a billionaire's gamble. I'm okay. I'm truly good without it. How about you, Sam?
I'm a child of the 80s, so I totally want to go to space. Sorry.
Fair enough.
I think this is actually a generational difference. I'm all in on it. Annie, that's all the time we have for this webisode. Hopefully this was helpful for you as you prepare for your exam. Remember, your third exam is on Monday, July 26th. Your window of time is from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. You'll have 70 minutes to take the exam. So just like with the last two exams, so make sure you study well, you organize your notes, and dive in and do well on that exam. And then your exit interview is due by 10 a.m. on Thursday, July 29th. It has been a pleasure being your professor for this semester. It's been a pleasure doing this with you, Annie. Any last words to the students as we head out?
Vote for me?
Yeah, you should probably vote for Annie because it is fun to think about tie breaks. But you should vote for me because my list is really fantastic because I have John Wesley on it. That's my big selling point. This has been fun, and we will see you further down the road. Say goodnight, Stacy.